We need to turn so that they can see the slides too. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. It is good to see everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. So for those of you I've not yet met, my name is Dr. Montgomery Hancock. I'm the Executive Director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity here at The Ohio State University. If this is your first time or the first time in a long time, we are very glad to see you, whether you are online, one of the 65 folks online, or whether you are part of this full house that we have today. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter for today, Dr. Greg Wilson. But before I do that, I'm going to just share a couple of housekeeping notes, both for inside and outside. So if you are online or if you are in the room, we typically hold all of our questions until the very end. So even if they're clarifying questions or things like that, we do allow our presenters, because this is a relatively formal context, to let them get all of their presentation done. And then we have a Q&A, and we usually alternate between the Q&A in the room and the Q&A that happens online, just to make sure that our online folks feel like they get their questions asked as well. If you are online, you can post your question, and Dr. Wilson will be fielding his own questions. So we will make sure that your questions are posted and brought into the room. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to announce to you, Dr. Greg Wilson is Provost Fellow and an Assistant Professor, now Assistant Professor of Management and Public Affairs, and by courtesy in Sociology here at The Ohio State University. He is also one of our Kirwan faculty affiliates, and I know we have several of those in the room, so we are excited to have you here. And if you're interested in that program, let us know. You can talk to me or go online and see more. And he's also a faculty affiliate for the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research agenda examines how and why the nonprofit sector itself is racialized and how this system impacts the work of nonprofits led by people of color, particularly those led by African Americans. His research has appeared in several locations, including Nonprofit and Voluntary Sector Quarterly, Perspectives on Public Management and Governance, and Sociology of Race and Ethnicity. He's currently working on a major theoretical article that proposes the existence of a racialized nonprofit industrial complex, a racialized social system that is created and maintained by an interconnected relationship between the state and philanthropy, where Black-led and white-led nonprofit organizations differ schematically in their approach to, acquisition, and understanding of key areas like leadership, funding, data, collaboration, and volunteering, which are typically thought to be race neutral, but actually whose differences constitute the racial structure of the sector. He's deeply committed to a pluralistic approach to inquiry, which prompts him to draw upon multidisciplinary theories, and he's guided by the axiom that the questions determine methodological choices, which leads him to employ diverse methodologies to answer questions. He earned his PhD in sociology at Wisconsin-Madison and also holds a Master of Arts degree in social sciences from the University of Chicago and an MED, Master of Education in Higher Education Administration, and Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and English, both from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So he is truly a product of the Big Ten, and we are so lucky to have him here, and you all are in for a treat. I saw him present some of his research a couple of months ago, and even though he'd already been a Kirwan faculty affiliate, I was like, I'm going to insist that you must present to our Kirwan Forum series. So without further ado, Dr. Greg Wilson.
Good afternoon to everybody. I think I have to stand close by here because this is how they hear me, I'm told. But it's a real honor to be in the Kirwan Institute, and I want to thank Montgomery for your renewed and invigorating leadership of this institute. And I would be remiss if I didn't comment about the importance of the work being done at the Kirwan Institute and other places around the United States in light of all of the challenges that we are facing in society. And so the work of the Kirwan Institute today, I think, is more important than at any other time in its history. And so I'm just absolutely delighted to be here to talk about racism because no matter what false narratives exist in our public discourse about DEI and all of these other kind of monikers that people have championed as a mechanism to disenfranchise and undermine the efficacy of people, these issues still exist. And we should be clear-eyed in our thinking. And that conceptual view informs so much of what I'm going to talk about today. And so I'm absolutely happy to be here to do so. And I look forward to a robust debate or conversation after this is over with, so that the ideas that are put forth here today can be strengthened and ultimately turned into not just an academic publication, but a manual of sorts to support people who are actually on the ground experiencing the challenges within a nonprofit sector that is all too often observed as kind of a race neutral space. The last thing I'll say in the way of introduction, or two more things. I'm not just a scholar of race and nonprofit work, I'm also a teacher. And so much of what I'm going to talk about and the style in which I discuss it will reflect some of the pedagogical techniques that have been a central part of what I do as an intellectual and as a teacher. Finally, I would just say that this paper was part of my dissertation back when I graduated from sociology at the University of Wisconsin. And last spring, I was at Stanford University in the business school as a visiting scholar. If you know anything about Stanford, I'm almost done too, by the way. I've already said most of what I want to say. But if you know anything about Stanford Business School, it's an incredibly theoretically driven place. But when I talked to them about this paper, they didn't really like it that much. But that's okay because I didn't like them much either. Just JK. But this paper has developed quite a bit since then. And you'll even note from the announcements that went out, the title has even changed. Because it reflects the recursive process of knowledge production. And so initially I titled this a schematic view of racialization. But that title had two problems. One was that it negated the cultural dimension that I'm going to spend some time talking about today. And two, I just really have a problem with the word racialization because I think it just sanitizes what really is actually happening on the ground. And we need to do a better job of disentangling these things around race. And so I'll try to do that a little bit today. So the revised title of this talk is A Culturally Schematic View of Racism, a Case of Black-led organizations in the Deep South. And I'll tell you what I mean by the Black-led organizations in the Deep South in just a moment. So let me just press a button to see if it will go through, and it won't. Let me see if I can click. I'll just click then. Okay, so here's the agenda. I'm only going to talk for about 40 minutes, even though I've already said most of what I want to say in that introductory set of remarks. I'm going to talk about what motivates this work, and then I'm going to get into the literature and theory, which is a pretty substantive discussion about cultural schemas and race. And then I'm going to talk about methods a little bit, And then I'm going to provide the analytic strategy and the findings. So I'll be presenting findings from 16 months of qualitative work that I did in Montgomery, Alabama, focusing only on a small part of that work, specifically interviews with leaders of Black-led organizations, and then go from there. Okay, so here's the motivation. So what do we know about Black-led organizations in the Deep South? And I use the term BLO to denote Black-led organizations because in the literature, I found that people have been very sort of sloppy in operationalizing what it means to be a Black-led organization. And as a sociologist, those kinds of operational dimensions of a paper are really important. Let me go back for a moment at the beginning. I also put a barcode here if anybody wants to get access to the presentation as well for you. So I can give you a second if you want to use the barcode. There, it also appears on every main slide as well for people to kind of get it. So if you don't get it now, you'll see it in a moment. Okay, so what do we know about these organizations? So much of what we know about Black-led organizations in the Deep South, unsurprisingly, is tied to the civil rights movement. So scholars pay close attention to well-known organizations such as the NAACP, SNCC, and MIA. And interestingly, about MIA, it's not even nearly as active as it used to be historically in Montgomery, Alabama. And these organizations have been at the forefront of pursuing racial justice, as we know. So Alden Morris's book, The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, is a notable exception because it emphasizes the role of churches and other small grassroots-based organizations who were operating during the civil rights movement, but he still focuses similarly on a lot of these larger organizations. And one of the key takeaways from this is that Black-led organizations were navigating this overt racial structure. So, think of whites only signs and all of the other ways in which African Americans were targeted during the Jim Crow era. What do we need to know about Black-led organizations in the Deep South? So first of all, we already know that contemporary forms of racism are more often structurally embedded. So specifically, I'm thinking of Benia Silva's path-breaking article, Rethinking Racism, that appears in the ASR from 1997, so a generation ago, where he lays out a structural view of what racism is all about. But we also know that the Deep South is home to considerable racial disparities in health, education, poverty, with nonprofits playing a central role in kind of addressing those issues. So I'll talk about that a little bit more. Moreover, smaller grassroots Black-led organizations in the Deep South are now operating in that covert racial structure and with considerably less resources than organizations on the historical record that have been the basis for much of scholarly inquiry. And we know little about the experiences of contemporary small Black-led organizations in the Deep South and how they navigate racism. In fact, because we don't disaggregate organizations on the basis of race, scholarly contributions on Black-led organizations and other organizations led by people of color is often quite limited. So here's the question that's the basis for this paper. How do Black-led organizations in the Deep South develop a culturally schematic view of racism within the nonprofit sector? And then I have these little lines that kind of help to clarify what is meant by some of these areas. So Black-led organizations in this paper are being defined as any organization who has an executive director or an equivalent, and a majority of staff who are identifying or a majority of full-time staff who are identifying as African American. So the average size of the organizations that I studied amongst the 40 was 3, the average number of employees. The Deep South, specifically Montgomery, Alabama, I lived there for 16 months, taught at Alabama State University, became immersed in the community. It was a wonderful experience that I'm happy to say more about. And I'm specifically talking about the human services nonprofit sector. These conceptual terms are really, really important because we so often think about the nonprofit sector as this kind of like universal thing without disaggregating it in a way so that we can actually analyze what's going on in specific parts of the nonprofit sector. Okay, so here's a preview of the argument. I'm just simply making the case that by virtue of operating in Montgomery and interacting with each other, Black-led organizations develop a culturally schematic view of racism that constitutes a socially shared understanding of the representational character of racism that automatically prompts actions to counter its effect. Bodyline and Sauter, they have an ASR article that I'm going to refer heavily to in this paper, where they provide this definition of cultural schema. And of course, as you engage in theoretically driven empirical work, it's really important for you to leverage those theoretical frameworks to make sense of whatever it is that you're trying to study in the social world. In this case, the experiences of Black-led organizations and how they develop a culturally schematic view of racism. Okay, and here's just kind of three very basic findings. I'm just going to tell you how they develop a socially shared view of racism in the form of like the identification of white privilege, funding disparities, and exploitative collaborations with white-led organizations. I'm going to talk about representational racism in terms of a permission structure existing within Montgomery, Alabama's human services nonprofit sector. Then I'm going to talk about the Black ask in fundraising, and then perceptions of Black-led organizations from the perceptions that Black-led organizations perceive white people in the sector of having of them. And then I'm going to talk about how the automatic recognition of and response to racism is prompted based on this particular schema, cultural schema. Okay, let me just talk about the literature and the theory for a moment. So much of the work on small Black-led organizations focuses outside of the Deep South. So there's a large body of knowledge that kind of examines the experiences of these groups. So as I said to you at the very beginning of this presentation, Black-led organizations that we take a look at in the Deep South are largely a product of the civil rights movement. And I've already told you who Black-led organizations are for the purposes of this work. I've shamelessly cited one of my papers with the definition there, because I think it's a really important definition that kind of gets the ball rolling on achieving the kind of conceptual clarity that I talked about at the beginning. So let me talk about the decision to kind of use racism for a moment. And I confess this slide is like not nearly as developed as the discussion in the paper is, but I'm just trying to kind of make a very basic point here. So we talk about race, racism, and racialization often, and we often entangle them in ways that limit, I think, their analytic utility, and we just kind of do so in a way that doesn't allow us to have a serious conversation about like what's really going on in the social world. So we already know about race as a social construction. It's this man-made system. There is no biological basis for race. That is the consensus. But we also talk about racialization and how racialization is the extension of racial meaning to a previously racially unclassified relationship, social practice, or group. Coming soon, hopefully this year, if it gets accepted to the journal that it's under review at, is my paper on the racialized nonprofit industrial complex, which kind of goes into more detail on this, that really urges us to fundamentally rethink how we understand the nonprofit sector. For me, though, following Benia Silva, I'm interested in the idea of racism, which is a network of social relations at social, political, economic, and ideological levels that shapes the life chances of various races. That's kind of what I'm talking about in this particular paper, and I'll go into more depth once I get to the appropriate part of the presentation. So let me talk about now the theoretical piece of this, which is kind of schema. I am all schemaed out. and you all have enacted so many schemas just in the short time that we've been together. I mean, you clapped after that wonderful introduction. You have sat quietly. Nobody has screamed. I mean, these are all schemas, right? So let me talk about what a schema is theoretically. So schemas, of course, have been an important part of inquiry across disciplinary boundaries, primarily in like cognitive science. And they're understood. This paper from DiMaggio, it's an annual review article. If you're a graduate student in the audience, one of the greatest pieces of advice I could give to you is to really, when you're trying to understand an issue, go read an annual review article. They're very, very instructive. They have blessed me immensely in my academic career. So DiMaggio in this paper says schemas are understood as knowledge structures that represent objects or events and provide default assumptions about their characteristics, relationships, and entailments under conditions of incomplete information. So that's from this annual review. So basically what he's saying is that schemas facilitate interpretations of information and potentially guide behavior based on previous experiences. But the key point, and this is why cultural schemas are really important and will become central to the work that I'm doing. Schemas are typically associated with individual cognitive processes, not group. And that's a key differentiator. And it only took me a year to figure that out. So examples of schemas, I gave you some silly examples. Other examples could be like somebody having a gender stereotype about women as being nurturing. If you go to a wedding like I do and officiate, you might wear something formal. You might go grocery shopping and you might like walk through each individual aisle for those of us who don't grocery shop very effectively. And you might use an umbrella during a rainstorm. I mean, schemas are just like unwritten rules for doing things that individuals adhere to. Okay, so schemas are useful because they represent a sensitizing device that pose empirical questions and provide a lens for interpreting observations. So the sensitizing device is a very key part of qualitative inquiry because it helps you make sense of whatever the phenomena is that you are actually trying to study. And from a sociological perspective, they are deeply connected to social behavior. So they can prompt an action. And in this work, they prompt Black-led organizations to take certain steps to counteract the racism that they encounter within the sector. And so that's what I contend here, that schemas are connected to how Black-led organizations develop an understanding of and response to racism in the nonprofit sector. Let me keep going to get out of your way. So I have to talk about some of the limitations. So one problem with schemas, as you saw from the slide that gave you some examples, that they tend to be quite ambiguous. And it's difficult to kind of sometimes understand what actually counts as a schema. And they've been overextended as a result. And scholars have suggested that their analytic utility has been diminished. And they have traditionally been limited to a focus on objects and events. But of course, as I say in the bottom in red, sociologists are concerned with people, organizations, social norms, and places. And places is going to be really important because much of the conversation about schemas does not always specify like where should we expect to find them. And so that's, I think, another contribution of this paper. So here's a quick recap. Again, schemas are typically associated with individual cognitive processes, but they're often ambiguous and overextended in a way that limits their utility in scholarship. So what's an alternative? I'm glad I rhetorically asked. Towards a cultural schema. So there's this wonderful paper from Bodyline and Sauter in ASR. Yes, ASR. Critical paper that helps bring conceptual and theoretical clarity to the idea of a schema. So basically, they're saying schemas have important analytic utility especially for individuals, but they have to be clarified so that they can be distinct. And we do that by adding a cultural dimension that moves us from the individual schema to a cultural schema that then we can apply to the experiences of social groups. Are you all still there? You all get, okay, good. Now, I'm going to talk about this in great detail. So what the authors argue is that cultural schemas are socially shared. I probably should have used blue. Red is like bad grade, right? Cultural schemas are socially shared representations deployable in automatic cognition. Cultural schemas are socially shared representations deployable in automatic cognition. I'm going to say it one more time just for people who need to hear it again. Cultural schemas are socially shared representations deployable in automatic cognition. That's going to be key for this work. And I add at the end, and can be influenced by historical, social, and physical environments. Cultural schemas are socially shared representations deployable in automatic cognition. I have sat with this definition for a year. Cultural schemas are socially shared representations deployable in automatic cognition and can be influenced by historical, social, or physical environments. Okay. So let me talk about each one of those for a moment. So a social group that possesses a common, so social sharedness refers to kind of a social group that possesses a common and collective understanding of something. So social interaction then is a principal mechanism, so us engaging with one another, in the case of this paper, Black-led organizations, through which cultural schemas become widely recognized and accepted amongst not individuals, but who? Groups. And sharedness does not mean universal, but it reflects a socially acquired understanding rather than something that is cognitive or biological in its structure. We can also test this qualitatively, incidentally, which is happening in this paper. Now, here I am saying, for the purposes of this intellectual exercise, that Black-led organizations are understood as a social group, that we can then think about the culturally schematic dimensions of their interactions. Are you all, does this make good? Okay, now, representation. So this is just about conveying meaningful information about the world, which allows a group to interpret and evaluate information. And it has these kinds of components. It borrows from schema. So the authors don't just throw the idea of schema out. They adapt some of the dimensions to it to describe the cultural schema. So default assumptions, characteristics or expected behaviors of various elements in the social world, categories of people, which I told you need to be extended, and these things kind of frame social interactions. So because there is a framework for understanding the representational character of something, it allows us to assess the authenticity of it as a researcher. And the representational nature in this social context, as it says here, allows for these cultural schemas to be potentially modified. So they don't necessarily have to be static. And what I'm suggesting here is that this representational character dimension of the cultural schema manifests itself in how Black-led organizations encounter racism within the nonprofit sector. Automatic cognition is just a cognitive process that occurs unconsciously. So there's this automatic activation in social situations, as you'll see in the data, that allow for unconscious inferences based on cultural norms that are specific to that group. Now, automatic cognition is critical, of course, in sociology because it helps explain how culturally shared schemas are seen in actions and social norms outside of individual awareness. And this is important for enhancing scholars' ability to more effectively analyze behaviors, cultural practices, and institutional dynamics. And so for Black-led organizations, it's this experience with racism, both in their individual lives, but also as collective organizations that equips them with the capacity to engage in what the authors call automaticity that responds to, are you? Oh, great. All right. I'm almost done. I want to get to the discussion. Now, here's the extension, because the authors don't discuss this. And, part of scholarship, you want to, engage people's ideas, but you also want to make sure that you're adding something to the conversation. It doesn't always have to be novel. It could be just a reinterpretation of something. But in this case, I am suggesting that social, historical, and physical environments actually matter for the proliferation or the development of a cultural schema. So, of course, historical environments refer to the various ways in which the past has shaped the present. I mean, if you're a historian, you already know that. Social environments also matter, and it can include organizations such as workplaces, schools, neighborhoods. Incidentally, in Montgomery, Alabama, one of the social environments that was central to this that I don't talk about in this paper was Alabama State University as a historically Black institution and an anchor institution in the community that convened people. And then physical environment, which includes public places. But I extend this view to the built environment of a city, especially Montgomery, Alabama, whose built environment serves as a monument to the injustices of the past and present, some people would argue. And as Fu argues, reinforces racial boundaries both symbolically and physically. Okay. Quick recap so you can take a break of cultural schemas. Cultural schemas are socially shared representations deployable in automatic cognition. Cultural schemas are socially shared representations deployable in automatic cognition and can be influenced by these three contexts. Okay, let me move on. All right, let me just give you a diagram because I mean, some of you might be visual learners, so I want to just make sure that I'm appealing to everybody so that when you do your classroom evaluation, okay. So cultural schema is that box right there. Here are the three components. I'm just connecting them to the nonprofit sector or how they apply to the experiences of Black-led organizations in terms of how they develop the culturally schematic view of racism. And I'm just applying that theoretical framework in the same way that I just described to you on the previous slides. That's it. It's just a visual representation. Okay. Let me talk about the methods and then I'll get into the data and then we'll be out of your way. Big research question appearing in that scarlet color. How do Black-led organizations in the Deep South develop a culturally schematic view of racism within the nonprofit sector? I've already told you that question. I showed you. I clarified what the key components of it are, and moved on. But the sub questions within that is like, oh, how does context set the conditions for the development of this schema, this cultural schema? So here now, I'm using schema and cultural schema interchangeably. But remember, I'm only focused on cultural schemas, but I'm just for the sake of argument here, or for the sake of time. What are the key components of the schema and how do Black-led organizations respond to the schema? Just from a pedagogical standpoint, I probably still should have written culture every time so that you won't be confused. But I'm talking about cultural schemas. So again, Black-led organizations, I've already told you about. Human services organizations are the ones that I'm concerned with. Entities responding to basic human needs. It's kind of the organizations that I looked at. Okay, so brief discussion of the method and the data. As Ange-Marie so eloquently read in the bio, this is a qualitative study, but it's a qualitative study not because I wanted it to be a qualitative study. It's a qualitative study because the question necessitated a qualitative research design. I could have done a quantitative study if I wanted to, if I was, for example, trying to understand the relationship between, funding allocations or Black-led organizations and funding allocations, where Black-led organizations represent the independent variable and funding allocations represent the dependent variable, and then I examine 990 tax data. I think that's a qualitative study. Questions must drive methods, and we should not be confined to our methodological silos just because of some, uncritical preference. All methodological tools in the toolkit should be deployed to help us achieve the most broad, informed understanding of an issue. 16 months of data collection where I lived in Alabama. I moved to Montgomery on my graduate student salary from the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin. When I got to Alabama, I was the richest person in the world. I lived downtown in a loft. I mean, I was that person there. So lived in Montgomery, Alabama for 16 months. As you probably note, it was actually during the pandemic. And if you know anything about the Deep South, it's not clear to me that the pandemic existed in the Deep South because everybody was still outside doing their thing. You could still conduct interviews with people. I was like meeting people, but outdoors because the weather was also nice. So that's also a methodological dynamic of this particular study. Semi-structured interviews with 40 Black-led nonprofit human services organizations in the city, including follow-up interviews, but I'm just using an N of 40 to denote the interviews. I only talked to leaders of Black-led organizations because in my previous work and in the existing literature, leaders of Black-led organizations play an outsized role. So in a lot of ways, they are the organization, and so you can glean a lot from talking to them. And so today I'm just going to talk about some of the interview data. None of this, I'll show a few pictures, but nothing else. But it's part of a broader study. When I first got here, I wanted to write a book because I graduated from sociology department, but the public affairs school said, no, we don't really know how to deal with books. We just want articles. And so I've turned every chapter into an article, basically. So yeah, all 5 of them, except the conclusion, are getting or either published or getting ready to be published. The data sources, again, observations, because we were in Alabama during the pandemic. The weather was nice. Nobody cared about the pandemic. I was one of the youngest people who was able to get the COVID shot when it came out because nobody wanted it. So lots of field notes, combing organizational websites, photographs, and tax records of organizations. But again, I'm only talking about interviews here, but I'm trying to give you a flavor of what I did while I was there. And incidentally, I compared Montgomery, Alabama to Madison, Wisconsin as the basis for my dissertation. So I studied Black-led organizations in Madison, Wisconsin, but also Montgomery. It would have been a great book, but so anyway, 2,982 total nonprofits in Montgomery with 501c3 status. 314 of them are human services organizations, and 40 identified. I identified 40 Black-led organizations that characterize themselves as human services, and they had an average of 3 full-time employees. There may be more, but it's very, very difficult because organizations are not disaggregated by race. When they become incorporated, there is no question on there. There's not a demographic question. There are other hints that you could find to indicate whether or not an organization is Black-led or not, but there's just not a way. Okay. Really quickly, I won't go through this. This is just an analytic strategy. You know, Mario Small's book with Jessica Clarko, if you do qualitative research, is indispensable. It's called Qualitative Literacy. Excellent book. His article called How Many Cases Do I Need is a methodological pep talk to qualitative researchers, but it also affirms the importance of rigor in qualitative inquiry so that it's just not like sloppily done. Okay, Qualitative Literacy is the book, and it's actually in the library available for digital copy here. And then How Many Cases Do I Need is just a research article that you could just Google. Okay, let me just talk about the analytic strategy. Going back to this diagram here, same thing I showed you earlier, and how I'm thinking about kind of racism in this middle category right here. And then I connected or used the cultural schema idea to kind of interpret a set of findings that emerge from interviews with the leaders of these organizations. And so that's kind of a preview of those right there. Okay, so let me just really talk about kind of the historical context of Montgomery, Alabama as a place that is rife for the development of like a culturally schematic view of racism. So of course, Montgomery has a legacy of slavery and segregation. So it was a key site for the slave trade. I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a moment. We all know about Jim Crow and the institutionalized nature of overt racism. Redlining was quite significant in Montgomery as well, and the destruction of Black neighborhoods in the 1960s for highway construction. There is a research agenda to be had for anybody who is interested in thinking about the destruction of, particularly from a sociological standpoint, the destruction of Black neighborhoods in southern cities. Montgomery and Birmingham are two remarkable examples. If you've ever been there and you just see how they just cut through communities, it's really remarkable. Okay, social context. I'm just going to give you a little chart for those people who are more quantitatively inclined. I have something for everyone. So just some basic census data. The Black population, it's a majority Black city, which is why I compared it to Madison, which is kind of a majority white city. So significantly more Black people in the city, significantly more Black people who are living below the poverty line. Black unemployment rate is about double what white unemployment rate is. And you can see the median household income right here. And so Montgomery just is a place where people are reminded on a regular basis of this kind of inequality. Next slide is just kind of the built environment. So I took these pictures. I'm sorry that they are crooked. It's just the way, I'm not a very good photographer, but the message is most important. All around the city of Montgomery are these kinds of reminders of its racial past. So you see here, these signs, like here says Montgomery slave markets, and this is actually just adjacent to a fountain in the center of downtown where they had slave auctions in Montgomery. This one says warehouses used in the slave trade, the Montgomerys. So all of these, this is just 3 examples. There are hundreds all around the city that kind of cultivate this ethic of awareness of race within the city. And so I contend that these things taken together contribute to an environment that is ripe for the development of a culturally schematic view of racism. So going back now to the more empirical findings with thinking about cultural schema as a lens, I should have probably put that here, the chart again, so that you could see it. But what the data suggests is that there is a socially shared view of racism that manifests itself in white privilege. And all of the data that I'm presenting today, I should have also noted in the methodology slide, is anonymous, and in the actual paper, it's assigned. They are assigned pseudonyms because they are afraid, literally, that speaking out against some of the issues that are affecting the nonprofit sector in Montgomery, given its small size, would potentially compromise their organizations. So this socially shared view of racism in the form of white privilege, one leader writes, since Montgomery is majority Black, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in our communities. We all live in the communities we serve, but white people do not want to move in our communities because of their reputation for blight and crime. But to make it easy for whites to move in the hood, white funders who had power worked to make sure that white nonprofit leaders and their families are comfortable living in Black neighborhoods. That means the white leader gets a lot of benefits, including living in a really nice renovated home when all the other homes in the neighborhood are just, or the opposite. I just wondered why they always got special treatment. Then there's this kind of socially shared view of racism and funding. And funding is the perennial issue facing all nonprofits, but especially Black-led nonprofits and other nonprofits led by people of color. But it's not the only thing. And that's some of my work, is really trying to emphasize that money is central, but there are many other things that organizations have to worry about. So one leader writes, it takes a lot of effort as a Black organization to get money. White funders embrace stereotypes thinking that we mismanage money and have ulterior motives for the money. They think we are here to do something for ourselves. Those are the norms that Black organizations deal with every day in Montgomery. These are daily beliefs that white people have of us, the Black-led organizations in the nonprofit sector. I've seen my white brother, so a leader of a white-led organization, go to the same funder and get $10,000 and I get 1,000, and the funder thinks it's fair because they think the white organization will manage the money better. In reality, I had a surplus and showed the ability to manage money, and he had a deficit, and they thought he was doing better than my organization. And then finally, on the social sharedness, there's a socially shared view of racism and collaboration. As this leader points out, it is really a survival skill to be able to deal with the clients you are trying to impact while also trying to deal with white collaborative partners that you don't like because they think so less of us and our ability to lead in the sector. And you have to come off as though you are giving as though they are giving you the ideas, even though you are the pinwheel of success in Montgomery. Black nonprofits don't want to be seen as uppity because that could make it very difficult for us to operate within the Montgomery sector. Shifting gears now to the representational character part of the cultural schema theoretical framework. The representational character of racism is manifested in what I call a permission structure within the sector, as this leader points out. I wanted to schedule a meeting with a white funder to discuss ways that my organization could get some support, and I wanted to bring my Black colleague to the meeting, who also ran a nonprofit. When I reached out to the funder to ask if this was okay, I was explicitly told I was not allowed to bring my Black colleague. The funder told me that the only way I could get the meeting was if I bought Jim, a longtime white nonprofit leader in the city, with whom I had worked with previously, whom he trusted to identify good Black leaders. So it's this idea of a permission structure that you have to navigate to get access to the funding networks within Montgomery. And then representational racism and what I call kind of the Black ask, as this leader points out. The white ask does not come with proven results. You don't have to prove anything when you are a white-led organization. The white ask can be simply because they know the funder and are a part of the white community or the white infrastructure, what they call an unseen country club. The Black ask is very different. We're required to prove our results. And even if it is effective, it is coming in the form of my Black skin that does not always get a favorable result. I remember one instance where we applied for funds and actually got selected after putting together a long application, but someone I know from a white nonprofit who had clout and status and could pick up the phone and did not even submit an application and got selected. White orgs have an advantage and start out ahead of us, so Black-led organizations. And finally, for the representational character of racism and these kinds of negative perceptions of Black-led organizations in Montgomery, as this leader points out. When I first started working in my nonprofit as CEO, I had 2 white females working under me in administrative roles. Every time a white person walked through the door, we would all be sitting at our desks and they would go directly to one of the white females because they thought they were in charge. I've been in the office by myself and white funders wanted to leave a check for an end of year contribution, and I almost had to pull out my ID to assure them that leaving the check with me was okay. Now, shifting gears to the third component of this theoretical framework, the automatic recognition of and response to racism. So as a result of their recognition of racism within the nonprofit sector, Black-led organizations respond in a number of ways that elsewhere I call a counter schema, but it is indicative of things like changing their organizational structure. So as this leader points out, we work directly with members of the community, and one way that we support them is through artistic expression because some of them are also artists. And so our bylaws are purposely structured to include that we are not merely a human services organization, but also home to an art gallery. This was important because we wanted to give clients an opportunity to show their work and eliminate the barrier of being required to have previously presented work in an officially recognized art gallery, which was required by the city in disconnecting the art community from Black artists. Another way that that Black-led organizations reported challenging the racial structure of this sector is through refusing to be exploited in their engagement with white-led organizations, as this leader points out. They, so white nonprofit funder, dangled a carrot and explained to me what comes along with taking their money. This was a regular practice with white funders who would come along and request pictures with Black kids, basically in exchange for giving us money. I knew what this was all about because other Black-led organizations that I partnered with and who said it in this study had a similar experience. We immediately declined this request because we didn't want to exploit our clients. Finally, Black-led organizations across the board assert agency in a variety of different ways. What I'm describing in this next quote is from a leader who asserts financial agency, writing, "I got tired of begging people, so white funders, for money, which we never got anyway. Most funders can give us basic non-monetary stuff like t-shirts. I am not being mean, but our guys are in the hood. They can't use that kind of stuff. These white funders always trying to give us stuff like this while often giving money to organizations led by white men." There's a wonderful research agenda about like white men in the nonprofit sector that I talk about in the paper. So I just stopped trying to get their money and started giving my own money to my organization. And that's how we are funded. We are not beholden to the preferences and priorities of white funders. Okay, so let me just hasten to a conclusion. So unsurprisingly, I don't have a citation here, but Kim and Lee suggest that the nonprofit sector is not a race-neutral space. In fact, following Elijah Anderson's work, the nonprofit sector can be understood as a white space that Black-led organizations have to navigate as a condition of their existence. Historical, social, and physical environmental factors, or the historical, social, and physical environment create the conditions in which a cultural schema can develop amongst these organizations. And I have suggested that Black-led organizations are a social group whose shared experiences facilitate the development of a culturally schematic view of racism. And their understanding of racism is automatically countered through what might be understood as kind of counter schemas in this text. So implications, and this is the last slide. There's a need for a robust theory of racism and racialization within the nonprofit sector, which I hope will be published, that I'm working on. And of course, there's a need for more equitable funding practices that demonstrate an understanding of BLOs. But there's also a need for us to recognize that capacity is a relative idea in the context of organizations. And just because you are a small organization does not mean you don't have the capacity to do the things that funders are requiring you to do. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion. Thank you for your attention. I welcome your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So again, we'll alternate between in the room and online. So Dr. Wilson, need to take questions as you need it.
Right in the back, it looks like we could be related.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Really interesting. This makes me think of some of the work that actually someone in the political science department talks about. Nicole Yaden, on the importance of like skin color and deepening discussions on racism. And I was curious, in your opinion, what role, if any, does colorism and the dynamic of skin color play in these cultural schemas? Have you noticed that lighter or darker skinned Black people approach navigating these kind of racial systems differently?
Yeah.
If you think that plays any role at all, and you might fit that into your work in the future.
Yeah, I mean, this is really an important point, and I spend a lot of time thinking about colorism as well. While it has not been present in this work, so the short answer is no, but you make me think about other intersectional dynamics that might be at play. So I'm specifically thinking about the experiences of Black women who lead nonprofit, which are far fewer than Black men across both sites. I studied 15 organizations in Madison. There were 3 in Madison, 40 in Montgomery, there was 5. So so your question is an important one for the intersectional implications that it I think implies, that I think I really want to think a bit more about. But even on this question of like colorism, I don't know that we think about that nearly as much as it is in other contexts. So Eduardo Bonilla Silva, of course, talks extensively about like issues around colorism in places like Brazil, as an example. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thanks for the presentation.
Yeah. Are you political science
Yeah.
person?
Yes.
I was a political science undergrad.
Yeah. It's great.
I got out of it because it was nothing like I thought about I thought it was gonna be like, I thought it was gonna be something completely different. And they're talking about propensity scores and please.
I'm gonna get your questions.
Oh, I'm sorry. Who in the world would ask a question online? This is so timely. I want to pick up on the slide on agency. How does funding from Black funders fit into this discussion? Do you think that Black funders largely replicate or challenge this schema? It's a very interesting question. And there's a second question that says, I see this work as potentially contributing to our understanding of mutual aid practices. Could you share your thoughts on this? So the first question is a very interesting one because it raises the specter of like Black philanthropy, which is a woefully understudied area. And in fact, one of the projects that I have in the pipeline, I haven't even started it yet, is to really study Black philanthropists. So there's a group of Black philanthropists that I was able to engage with 2 years ago in Chicago as part of the MacArthur Foundation's like convening. And it was like one of the largest gatherings of Black philanthropists. It was like 70 people who were just like Black fundraisers who are working in and across a number of these agencies. And so, to the substance of the question, I don't know the answer to it, and it's okay because that means that there's an opportunity to find the answer. But I would suspect that there would be a mix of both. I would suspect that the Black funders are trying to make sure that these dollars are going to Black-led organizations, but it's not inconceivable for me to also believe that Black philanthropists might also be complicit, knowingly or unknowingly, in the proliferation of inequality on the basis of funding. Second question that was raised is about mutual aid practices. I don't really know the answer to that question. I worked on a mutual aid project as a grad student, and I was deeply inspired by the generosity of people. I just wonder if it could be a sustainable practice for the type of work that Black-led organizations are doing. I mean, remember, even before the debacle of Donald Trump, and I'm just going to say his name, it's a total disaster in my view. But even before the debacle of Trump, the social safety net has been rapidly declining in the United States of America. And so it is nonprofit organizations who are increasingly picking up the slack and being tasked with delivering the kinds of services that would be historically provided by government. And so for me, I love mutual aid. I just don't know if it would be like the solution for this issue. I mean, the solution is like racial equity, I mean, broadly conceived, but that would require the dismantling of the capitalist structure that too many people, friends and foes, are complicit in maintaining. But that's not my business. Other questions from people? Here.
I just wanted to, so first of all, thank you for this amazing presentation. Before coming here, I lived in Mississippi.
Oh, I love Mississippi.
So closure, the Council of Federated Organizations where the Freedom Summer kind of was organized. But something that I noticed in the South, and I'm thinking about this intersectional approach, is the intersection of class. In class and age within Black organizations that complicated how they understood themselves and the roles that they played or culture schemas that they had.
Yeah.
The other one that I was wondering about, internal networks within these, so like, maybe breaking up this concept of like Black-led organizations to the kind of dynamics within them and the intersection with them. That something I often noticed was divine mind status being a sub-network within broader work.
Or some people would call it cult.
Correct.
I'm teasing.
And so like that is something that I definitely noticed, especially in the South. And so I was wondering if any of those dynamics class, age, and divine nine status
Yeah.
came into play in any of the.
So one of the things that's interesting, and thanks so much for your question, is not in the Montgomery. Montgomery was sort of an interesting case because I didn't talk about this in this presentation, but the civil rights ethic of that region binds people together in the cause of like justice, like Black-led organizations. I mean, that's a rallying cry for them. In Madison, it was very an interesting intersection because you had what I talk about in another paper, old Black Madison and new Black Madison. So Madison, Wisconsin. Old Black Madison is the older, more established, indigenous to the community Black leader who has meaningful relationships with the white nonprofit sector. And they are the ones who are favored within that arrangement. And they are the ones who are contributing to the status quo, dare I say. And then you have new Black men, which is young, Black, trans, in some cases in Wisconsin, leaders who very much would have embraced the implicit call to dismantle the capitalist system that I was just joking about. And so that dynamic was quite present in Madison, Wisconsin. Not as much in Montgomery, but there are other factors as well, like religion is an important dynamic, especially in the South. I mean, these people do this work because they feel called by God. That's a separate paper, you know. On the question of Divine Nine, no, I didn't see a lot of that. That kind of behavior in Montgomery, where the Divine Nine was an outsized presence for sure. But I'd have to go back and look at the data and the coding to see if there was a relationship between status and divine, you know, in a Divine Nine organization and some kind of outcome within the sector. But I think it's a really important question. Why are these people asking all these questions? Just kidding. I'm kidding. What recommendation would you offer to ameliorate this social fact that you studied? I mean, let me just say thank you for your question. The reality of American society is that we operate within a system that is fundamentally unequal. Somebody has to be at the bottom. Unfortunately, it just happens to always be people of color. And so until we think carefully, I don't want this to like go viral that I'm like saying we need to overthrow the government or something like that, although that already happened in 2000 anyway, in 2020 on January 6th, at least an attempt. But until we get serious about changing this system, nothing's going to change. Fundamentally, I mean, it is a system that is rooted in the types of social inequality that we see. It's just a fact. People can talk about, and every time we try to kind of address these issues, they are turned back. DEI is a great example of that. I know I'm going on a soapbox now, but people are just like, you know, the Republican Party in particular has won the narrative on DEI because media and with their big platforms, instead of interrogating like what DEI actually is, have just like conceded the Republican talking point rather than say, we need DEI. And this, first of all, it's not working anyway because only 3% of tenure track assistant professors in the United States of America are African American. So DEI isn't even working. And so, to this important question, I'm not sure, short of reimagining a system that does not intentionally disadvantage people of color. Hey, please.
Yeah, I mean, definitely also just want to echo how important what you're working on is, especially in this moment, as you said.
That means a lot coming from
Yeah,
you.
but I guess one thing, this is maybe asking you to extend, beyond the focus of this particular study, but
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this concept that's, I think at least has some origins in political science, but which is like the social construction of target populations for policy. And the way that, here you're focusing on, Black-led organizations, but I wonder if these same cultural schemas apply to the decisions that are made about who the target populations are. Ostensibly, people think in their heads are the target populations of nonprofit and NGO funds. And the reason I was thinking about this is because when you hear exactly the conversation that's been happening recently with USAID, and all the, everyone is going through the public database, which has been there forever, but suddenly now everyone is going through and saying, well, look, this money's going to this group. And a lot of it, to me, has felt like it's these exact cultural schemas you identify, but focus on who is a deserving target population and who is not. So, we shouldn't fund PEPFAR because the people it's going to benefit are not the people who are deserving. We shouldn't have U.S. money going to benefit, Black and brown people, especially who are not here. So both thinking about the global scope of what you're talking about, and if these same schemas don't just apply to the leadership of the organizations, but in the funding decisions about what kind of target populations might be involved in the allocation.
Yeah, such an excellent question. And another example that that reminds me that schemas are making a comeback in intellectual discourse. I do think that it is entirely possible. Now, the people who are in charge at the local, state, and federal level may not think about they certainly are not thinking about their decision-making processes through this schematic view. But just an anecdotal empirical example that you just described suggests that something is guiding it. And that's all schemas really are, to dictate social action of some kind. In this case, the allocation of a material resource. So absolutely, I think that this is, and I just wrote it down because I think I can envision a study that we could do together where we take a level of government. It doesn't even have to be the federal government. USAID is just in the news, but it could be even at the local level or the state level, where we engage bureaucrats on these issues. And I bet we would be able to come up with a similar theoretical contribution in the way that you were just suggesting. I'm going to email you about that. Thank you for your question. Somebody else got a question? Let's see here. We have two more. Okay. Somebody said this is an excellent breakdown. I'm a sociologist and never could figure out what a schema is. Look, I still don't. Okay, interested in two mediating domains and how they matter. So the question is, how does religious affiliation matter in shaping these dynamics? Also, levels of stigma vary. Okay, yeah, I agree with that. For organizations that address HIV amongst Black women, for example, how might stigma shape the Black ass dimension? I mean, that's Very interesting. So taking the second question, none of the organizations that I studied focused explicitly on health, but the question does remind me of another challenge that Black-led organizations reported in my work in Madison, namely that in the course of doing their work, Black-led organizations in Madison, reported engaging people who had criminal justice involvement. But in the course of doing that, they encounter other people in that same household who are dealing with the multidimensional effects of poverty. And so they are then compelled to also provide support for that for that household as well. But in the broader nonprofit schema that says you need to be narrowly tailored to something with respect to your mission, they're engaged in what's seen as mission drift. And that's seen as a signal that the organization is not in a stable position, even though they're having an impact. The second part of this question was religious affiliation. I mean, I sort of talked about this too. This could be a separate paper. Religion is a major part of the work of Black-led organizations in the nonprofit sector, not in a way that indoctrinates people, but they feel led by God to actually engage in this work. And so it's a precursor to a lot of the work that they do. Other questions? You had a question in the back, and then we'll come on. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. How are you?
I'm well. So I wanted to share that I was in Montgomery in the fall.
Okay.
Of a portal for being
Okay.
Black, healing Black. There were 50 leaders and titans that came together to talk about that in Montgomery. And we toured the Legacy Museum and it changed
Yeah.
my whole world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? So if nobody's been, you need to go and see that, prepare yourself,
Yeah.
prep yourself.
I went all the time.
Yeah, you gotta prep yourself. So just having said that, just sharing that. What did you find, if this was a point of your research around Black-led nonprofits, but having predominantly white boards?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good question.
But I've served on a number of boards, and they've always been predominantly white, but they were Black-led.
Yeah. Really good question. So, one of the things I've tried to do in my work is to be very kind of not very, but as precise as I can about how I understand organizations. And so much of my focus exclusively is on the day-to-day operations of these organizations. The board dynamics that you talk about is a critically important area of study that remains understudied. In fact, in nonprofit scholarship, I mean, people talk about boards to be clear, but the racial dynamics of those boards, that conversation is still nascent in nonprofit scholarship, and so I don't have anything substantive to add except to suggest that I can imagine all of the ways that tensions might arise in those kinds of arrangements. And I'm specifically, so tensions, yes, but in Montgomery, Black leaders were routinely serving on each other's boards, which was an important factor in creating the kind of social cohesion and collective efficacy that you didn't see in Madison, where there was a divide and conquer strategy because there were so few Black-led organizations in a predominantly white city. So a question online says, how do you check your implicit bias, especially as a Black person doing this research? And what would you recommend to mitigate bias when doing research and the subject matter and participants are similar? I really like this question because whenever you do qualitative research, I mean, there's just always going to be, I'm not suggesting this about the questioner, but there's always an underlying assumption that there's going to be bias uniquely associated with doing qualitative research. And before I talk about how that is mitigated, I want to just make very clear that all research involves bias. I mean, I hate to be the bearer of bad news. When you're doing quantitative work and you are doing survey work in particular, you are making choices about which variables so you're making choices about which variables you're going to use as the basis for your analysis. I mean, that's putting your finger or that's like bias. Like, so the big point is that all research involves some level of bias, but to the credit of the questioner, the important thing is to kind of mitigate it. And so that's why Mario Small's work has been so important for me and so instrumental in my approach, because I am a Black person studying these issues who has also been the victim of racist practices and things like that. Unfortunately, I cannot change that. But what I can do and what I do on a regular basis in the course of doing my work is to take care to exercise what Small and Calarco call cognitive empathy. What that means is that I am not studying people with the intent on getting a particular answer to something that I think should be the answer. Instead, I am trying to, as is the fundamental point of qualitative inquiry, to understand an issue as the people who are experiencing it themselves understand it. And that's the standard. And so I always come back to, am I representing the perspectives of the social world broadly conceived as they understand it? Always. And so there, of course, in qualitative research, there are a number of ways that that can be accomplished. You can accomplish it through what's called member checks, triangulation, and other techniques that I adhere to. So, good. Thank you for the question.
Good time for maybe one more.
Okay.
I just so I grew up in the Midwest and I moved to Montgomery for high school. Small world. Right after 9/11, when at the time, the high school I went to, second biggest high school was called Jefferson Davis.
Oh, yeah.
And the calendar celebrated, like officially, celebrated Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Some of these things have changed, including Robert E. Lee, Jeff Davis, and changed in 2020. But in the cafeteria in high school in the Midwest, Black folks, white folks, and like in Montgomery, the tables were rows like this. And although it was an integrated school, there was just a schema, an unwritten rule where people would self-segregate, so to speak, where the school is 50-50 Black and white, essentially. Each table would be half Black and white. And another note, Manning Marable talks about this in Black Leadership.
Yeah.
But like the reason we went there was my grandfather, who was a bishop in Montgomery, was like ill from cancer. So my father, who's a Pentecostal pastor, goes to take over his church. And the reason we end up there happens to be the church. But Marable theory of the church as a kind of organizational, and a space of convening, so on and so forth. That was almost exceeded religious ideology. like yourself to even like secular sort of social structures. That's all I mean, I have plenty more. You have a lot. Oh, you know what else? The comment that just came, I'm an art historian. The comment that just came is true. So there are Black museums, right? That are kind of like bastard stepchild of the real canonical pantheon, like Black museum structure.
Yeah.
They kind of, you know, yeah, they're token. So to speak. They don't have power, they don't have the same amount of funding, but their boards
Yeah.
tend to be corporate.
Yeah.
Whether the folks are Black or white, they still are representing Wells Fargo,
Yep.
Citgo, what have you, because of who it is that even thinks that they would be the kind of person who would be on the board, who has the means to sit on the board, and who the museum wants to attract as board members for funding.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, just real quick, just you remind me of Brian Stevenson's organization, the Equal Justice Initiative, that has received a lot of acclaim, but actually doesn't play well in Black-led circles in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's not even a Black-led organization. Well, at least when I was there, they had a lot of like white folks that kind of comprised, but that's an interesting case study that you just made me think about, but more to come. Thank you all so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And all this will, if you're still online, these will be available online as well. And we recommend if you would like to continue this discussion, reach out directly to Dr. Wilson. Thank you.
all right.